Welcome to the transition video tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to use transitions to create special effects when transitioning between resources or components or items in your presentation. Now in this tutorial, I'll show you how to build transitions that move between A and B points, meaning that if you have component A on your timeline and you're moving to component B, you can enable a transition, what we call an out and an in, and I'll cover that in this tutorial. I'll also demonstrate how to enable the transitions at different levels of the presentation, such as campaign, timeline, and channel, and how each particular level will inherit from the level above it. And also we'll cover transitions between items, such as catalog and the XML player. So we'll switch over to navigation and transition, and click on a plus sign to add a brand new pool. We'll just go ahead and call this my pool. Click on next, and we can set paper 3D type transition by default or basic 2D for our first point, and click on finish. We'll just select the default, and you can see that right now I just have a single point called transition under my pool. So if I go ahead and click on play to preview this particular transition, you can see that I get a really nice smooth effect. Again, very simple transition. Now let's go ahead and add to our pool another transition point, but this time we're going to select a basic 2D preset 1, click on finish, and again click on play. So you can see that I have another very smooth transition. This is considered to be 2D, and you can see the properties right here, and this is 3D, and you see different properties right here. Now you may be wondering, why do we call this a pool? And the reason is because this pool, in this case it's called my pool, can have all these transition items. And so what's going to happen is that every time the signage player runs and it gets to a point where it needs to transition between two things, it will grab the next transition item. So you can keep things interesting. You can have a whole bunch of transition items, and as long as you set, let's say, a campaign to use my pool, it will just continuously grab these transition items one after the other, and when they're all done and over, it's going to start and cycle through them again. So you can just add a whole bunch of transition items into a pool and keep things interesting. Now if you wanted to keep things simple, you can just have one single pool, in my case my pool, and just have a single transition item, and so this my pool will always run exactly the same transition. Anytime that it moves between two items, it will always simply run this. But again, if you wanted to keep things more interesting, you can just add more transition items and have them constantly change. Now you don't have to use our specific settings. You can create your own transition items. So if we select this one right here, well, let's go ahead and call this our 3D and call this our 2D, just so we know we're dealing with two different transition items. And you can set, for example, here on your transition 3D, you can set things like the duration. You can also, if you select the 3D property, you can, for example, select how many loops it does or the depth. So for example, if we set 5 loops in the Y direction and give it a depth of, let's say, 10, you'll see that the image will actually kind of float all the way to the back and come back to the front, since we gave it a depth right here. So click on play. You can see that very easily you can create your own transitions. You can also cycle very slowly to kind of pause this and kind of see how it behaves. So you can move back and forth and look at the transition and see if you don't like it, you can actually make changes to it. So it's very flexible. Now this will be the 3D. Now let's go ahead and review the 2D transition. Set it to be 5 seconds, so this will be a long transition. And under the properties, again, you can see you can set the rate, you can set the rotation. So for example, we give it 1,000, so it's actually going to create several rotation spins. Set the pivot X to maybe 2, and the scale, go ahead and make it maybe 2.5. Click on play to preview it. And you can see it's taking a lot longer. And again, very super and smooth transition. So it's very flexible and allows you to really modify the different properties and behavior that you want for your transitions. Now you'll notice that the 2D has actually two modes to it, the out and the in. Out meaning that the resource that's currently in view, whether it's an RSS or a video or an item on the timeline, so this is with respect to how it's going to move out of view, and in reflects the item that comes right afterwards, how it's going to come into view. So in a 2D mode, you can set the out and the in affecting this particular item on the timeline, for example, and the one that comes right afterwards. Now in 3D mode, you don't have that in and out because essentially you're just dealing with kind of like a flat view that flips over. So if, for example, we'll make the duration here to be maybe 6 seconds, so it runs really slow, and set this to be a little bit lower so you can kind of see better, and we run this, you see it's kind of like a paper that has two sides to it. And so 3D doesn't really have the same in and out like 2D does. And again, it's your choice and you can pick between these two modes. And so now that we understand how the transition pool works, let's go ahead and switch to our timeline and see how we can actually apply transition at the level of the campaign, at the level of the timeline, or the channel. So we'll select the campaign right here to load up its properties. You can see that you can enable the pool at the level of the campaign. I'll go ahead and make a little bit more room here so you can see more of the screen, and click on play. And you can see that it's going to go ahead and grab a pool item. So it first did the 3D, now it's doing the 2D. And now with 3D again, because again it cycles through our two pool items. Now I'm not sure if you noticed, but the content actually got clipped by this green screen division. So just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and maybe put right here some more content, and I'll go ahead and click on play to preview my presentation. And you'll notice that we're having transition on both channels, but the content is actually getting clipped by the screen division right here. So let's see how we can fix that. So we'll go ahead and switch to our transition editor again and go to our 2D and remove the clipping. And I'll go ahead and click on play, and you'll see how the content actually kind of bleeds over for the 2D transition into the other screen divisions because I'm not clipping it anymore. I think next you see here where you'll see the content. You see right here where you can kind of see the content underneath. That's because clipping has been removed. Next, we're going to talk about the GPU background. Now, sometimes you use scenes, and you also want to make sure that when you use a scene, the background will be incorporated into your transition, meaning that you're not just going to see a black background, but you'll actually see an image that's sitting behind everything else. Over here, for example, I have a screen division with two channels, channel 1 and 0, and you can see that channel 0 is sitting below channel 1, and I've put an image right here. You'll see there's just the flowers, and I'll go ahead and enable the GPU. In other words, I'd like the image to still show in the background while the transition is taking place. So let's go ahead and click on play to see how this works. You notice that I can still see the background, and now the transition occurred and I was still able to see the flowers in the background. And so anytime you want to incorporate the background into the transition, make sure you enable GPU background. Now keep in mind this can only be enabled for SWF as well as images. Now, in addition to setting the transition at the campaign level, the timeline level, or the channel level, you can also do it at the individual resource or component level. So for example, if I take an RSS, put it on the timeline, double click to load up its properties, and go to player. I have the transition tab here as well. By default, it'll inherit from the campaign just like before, but if I wanted to customize it, I can set my own level right here just like before. And this of course can also be done for a video or an image or any type of resource that you drag onto the timeline. And just before we wrap things up, I just wanted to mention that you can also set the transition at the individual item level for special components. For example, the catalog, the XML, for example, the collection component, all these can be set. So for example, when the collection component transition from one item to the next, you can set the individual transition to get it from a specific pool as well. So if, for example, I take the collection, put that on the timeline, double click to load up its properties, just like I showed you a second ago, you can go to the player and set the transition, but you can also set the transition for the individual items. So when you're switching between items in the collection, you can go over here under general and set the transition as well. So you have finer control on collection, XML, and other type of item components. So I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. If you have any questions, be sure to let us know. Thank you.